to think about why that would be so. What was going on in 1971 that made it so hard for people to see this film and to let it circulate in larger kinds of ways. I wanted to just raise 3 issues that struck me as I was watching the film with you tonight, and we can take those farther if people want to take those farther, or if people want to go in other directions, we can do that as well. I want to talk a little bit about reception of the film, sort of thinking about the kind of powerful testimonials that emerge and the contradiction of the very slow reception. I want to talk a little bit about race as it emerges in the film, I think in especially powerful ways. And finally, I want to talk a little bit about the Vietnamese and the Vietnamese dimension of the war, and how that emerges, and in some ways, not to be critical of the film, but how there's another story to be told there as well. So to begin, it's remarkable to me, watching this film, the honesty of the individuals who are telling their stories. They are not telling stories that put them in an especially good light. They are telling painful things that they had done in the past, but there's always been an incredible suspicion by, it's easy to say by conservatives, but actually if you look at sort of general American popular opinion, public opinion in this period of time, about the kind of testimony that veterans like this were giving. That somehow they were lifting up things that maybe happened sometimes, but not very often. Or if they did, it was bad apples that made these things happen. There was nothing really systemic in what was going on with the war. All kinds of stories that people were able to tell themselves to say, well, yes, but, right? And I think you watch the testimony, and you're even more incredulous about how people could do that, right? Again, just ordinary people telling stories that are horrific in many ways. I mean, the story, if you think of the guy who's showing the photograph of the dead Vietnamese that he's posing with, not unlike the Abu Ghraib photographs that were circulating more recently. Again, you know, to what end could somebody be making up these stories, right? But again, time after time after time, when Americans have to think about their own atrocities at war, it seems very, very hard for them to do. So this film emerging at the time that the My Lai massacre was becoming known, again, a similar sort of reaction to that. Well, you know, it's a bad apple, there's nothing systemic here, et cetera, et cetera. And right through to the present day. So an excellent book by Nick Turse called Kill Anything That Moves. It came out 2 or 3 years ago, talking about how it was systemic, the kinds of behavior that we see in the film. And what Nick has that's quite amazing are Pentagon documents that walk us through how these things happen. So the Pentagon was collecting all kinds of testimony and materials about a whole set of things that went on during the war, and kept it basically under lock and key. Nick was able to use some of these materials for the book, and again, one gets a much more three-dimensional sense of the systemic nature of what was going on here. That book attacked just like people were attacked in 1971 for saying these kinds of things. Oh, no, it's not really systemic. Oh, we've heard all these stories. Oh, how come the stories always sound the same? You know, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that inclination not to want to look has been there for a long time. I would say it's true with Abu Ghraib as well. One of the reasons that the film had a power for people in the early 2000s, that it started to circulate again, emerged out of the endless war that goes on in the Middle East with the Americans. So the film, in a way, had a kind of second life in helping people think about that, but that resistance sat there in again, powerful ways. I can't help but disentangle seeing this film tonight from having watched the Ken Burns documentary. Milos mentioned this at the beginning. This is a sort of like anti-Ken Burns, and I think that's quite right. How many people in the room watched parts, at least, of the Burns documentary?
What was it called?
The Vietnam War. It was on PBS in September. It was over 18 hours, so over 2 weeks.
I watched it twice.
Watch it. Did anybody watch all 18 hours?
Yeah, twice.
Yeah, okay, some people did. But so some did, some didn't. there was a huge fuss about that documentary. You know, I mean, it was out in the media, what it was about was out, there was a lot of self-promotion about that. It had a very problematic way of thinking about Vietnam. It wasn't clear to me that 18 hours later I understood why we were in Vietnam any more than I did before I started in, 18 hours before. But this kind of dimension of the war, it's not unmentioned in the film, in the 18 hours, but it gets lost in a sense, right? And the question that those veterans kept asking over and over again is, in a way, it's the atrocities and it's speaking truth about the atrocities, but it's also simultaneously asking why. How come it happened? Why were we there? Why were people doing what they were doing? And that's what ultimately the Ken Burns documentary couldn't answer. You never understood why we were there. So again, watching this film from this distance in 1971, you start to understand why. And I think one of the reasons you understand is the second issue that I wanted to raise a little bit with people, is the way in which the film deals with race. So that incredible sequence where the young black man is talking to the white soldiers who have been up, talking about the kinds of testimony they're doing, and just trying to introduce into the conversation, there's another set of things that's going on here. And that set of racial attitudes is an important reason for thinking about the why question in the war. Again, not something that I think Americans have found easy to grapple with over time. But as the Native American vet says, you think about the Indian Wars, you think about the Civil War, you think about the American War in the Philippines, when in fact the language of, quote, gooks was first developed by American service people, and the kinds, again, of behaviors that were narrated in this film that went on in the Philippines. You think about the Pacific War during World War II, you think about the Korean War, you think about Vietnam. There's a long arc in thinking about the ways in which race is fundamentally embedded in American foreign policy and decisions that are made about war, not just in Asia, but in other parts of the world as well. So the fact that the film really puts that front and center and wants us to really think about that and see the significance of that, again, strikes me as a very important dimension of the film. The third and last thing I wanted to raise with people was a question of the Vietnamese themselves. And this I find harder to talk about in certain ways, and I'm not ultimately sure how to think about it. During the war, the kinds of things that the vets in this film we're talking about went on an all too regular basis. During the war, these kinds of things went on and were actions that were committed by North Vietnamese Regular Army troops who were in South Vietnam. They were committed by National Liberation Front soldiers in South Vietnam. They were committed by the ARVN, the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, so the South Vietnamese Army. And they were committed by, we had certain allies during the Vietnam War, not a lot of them, but some. And quite famously, at the very same time the My Lai massacre was going on, there was a similar kind of massacre in a village not so far from My Lai, and that massacre was perpetrated by South Korean troops. The reason that it's hard to talk about this is because those facts get politicized a lot when people bring them up. So, if you're on kind of the conservative side of the spectrum, what you say is, well, the American troops had to do these kinds of things because look who they were fighting, right? People who would do this kind of thing. So it becomes a justification in a way, right? So you can't really talk about it in a way. It just gets moved into a kind of polemical zone. For people who were, in a sense, trying to be more sympathetic to what was going on in Vietnam, trying to take Vietnamese lives seriously, believing that Vietnamese lives mattered, sometimes were a little hesitant to talk about these issues, right? Because they were afraid if you put those out, that too was going to make the conversation a more difficult one. So as I say, I don't really have necessarily a way of thinking about how you put together the simultaneity of those things happening together. And I certainly don't want to argue that there's necessarily a hierarchy of violence and that some violence is better or some violence is worse or whatever, but I do want to say that it was happening. We know from testimonials in Vietnamese, written in Vietnamese, spoken in Vietnamese, by a whole variety of ordinary actors, that these things were happening as well. So that's not what the film's about. There's no expectation that the film should be talking about that. I don't raise it to critique the film, but simply to say it's a problem. And it's also a problem, I think, if you think about war today. And so, if, in fact, war enables this kind of behavior on multiple sides, do we also have to expand the conversation outside of the nation into some kind of more moral, global, transnational space in thinking about what war brings? So, those were sort of reception and testimony, race, and then thinking about this kind of problem of multiple violences happening were the things that I wanted to lift up to people, but I think people should take this in any direction they want to go. So, reactions, comments about the film? Yeah?
Well, I did watch that Vietnam series 2 times entirely because I was very picky about it, and I thought, well, maybe I'm being unfair, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
And actually, I started timing, because people in the class I was taking were saying, oh no, they covered the black race issue and blah, blah, blah. And so I timed the amount of footage, and it was like, for the women, it was 1 2-minute segment and 1 3-minute, and it was just one white nurse, that was it.
Yeah.
Okay, and then for the actual, you know, in addition to the 2 talking heads, the black men, who really didn't get to the race directly, but they certainly got to it with their tone of voice.
Sure.
But otherwise, there was like 3 minutes of reference to race.
Yeah.
So my question, though, is that it came up in the class that the veterans that people in the class knew did not want to see the Vietnam film, that they were already very angry. They did learn, I felt like I learned a little bit about why we were at war, why it continued, and so that it made them feel even worse watching the film and the LBJ stuff. So a lot of them just did not want to see it. So I'm wondering, in terms of this film, Winter Soldiers, I'm thinking that maybe in 72 or 7, whenever it was released, that it wasn't maybe widely seen and maybe a little too raw, and I'm wondering if you have any information on how the actual Vietnam veterans have responded to this particular piece.
The film we've just seen,
Yes,
or Ken
exactly.
Burns, or both?
No,
this one.
Ken Burns.
Yeah.
No, this one. I mean, you can talk about, I'm just saying, my question is about this film.
Yeah.
I would open up to the Vietnam veterans and the audience.
Yes,
Yeah.
you have.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, there was a veteran, she had to walk out, she was too
Is
sure.
there anybody
Yeah.
here who was there? You're kidding me. There's nobody here who was there? I'm the only one?
You're not alone, I wasn't in Vietnam, but I was in Kosovo. And
What?
I'm a veteran as well, so you're
You're
not
a veteran of Vietnam?
Yeah, I mean, you can tell the vets are in the back.
You gotta be kidding me.
Well, okay,
I
so-
came here to see if anybody was, how many people were gonna scream their bloody heads off. So I guess I'm lucky, I won't have to listen to anything, will I?
That sounds like it.
So does anyone know how any veteran, Vietnam veteran has responded to this
I
documentary?
mean, what do you know about the history of Vietnam veterans against the war? At the peak of their like height, they had 40,000 members.
Yes.
40,000 people, Vietnam veterans were like, we don't want to do this anymore. They're ultimately, the documentary you should watch after this would be Sir No Sir.
Yeah, I've seen-
Our generation looks up to them. They're the ones that ended the war. It's not the people that were sitting in the movie theaters watching it. It was the veterans
Did
that
you
were like.
see,
That's-
combat? Did you see combat in Vietnam?
I wasn't in Vietnam.
Huh?
I was not in Vietnam.
she
So
was
I'm
in
the only one who
Kosovo.
saw combat in Vietnam this
Well, you
year?
have to define combat.
Yeah.
You have to define combat.
Fighting the guys right against them.
We would just drop bombs. We would just drop a bomb and destroy the whole community. So we weren't shooting and firing.
You were were you flying an airplane?
I was the plane captain. I was the one
Huh?
who started the engines for the
What?
planes.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, you
I know
kill,
what. I know
you can
what.
kill people a lot of ways, but you asked
We
me what
destroyed whole
I did.
communities, not just one person at a time.
This is not, this, what kind of conversation are you talking about here?
I know. Like, really, it's like this
No,
film.
no
Can I
veterans
just say,
here?
this film is 30 or 40 years old.
Yeah.
The Pentagon Papers came out around then. Watergate was going on. I mean, there's
Nobody
this,
knows about Iraq and Afghanistan when they did their Winter Soldier in 2008?
yeah, I mean, you know, we have a history of genocide in this country that's codified and repressed and allowed. And I think all this movie speaks to is it just continued in Vietnam. It had nothing to do with any policies. If you look at the McNamara reports and what Johnson was getting fed, it has nothing to do with any real, you know, preventing communism or any of that.
This film is very real. It's a reflection.
I know that's
Let him
real.
finish.
I'm not saying that's
I'm
not
saying
real.
that.
That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying our government policies are so fucked up. And they have nothing to do with real, that's why I didn't watch Ken Burns. It's like, I know enough about our history, I'm so disgusted with it, I don't even want to live here. But it's like,
Norway.
I don't know, I'm just stating, like, the genocide of the Native Americans, the slave and the black issue here, no reparations, treaties are broken, it's historical, it's whitewashed in textbooks. You have to have a movie like this, you have to have a book as an expose for people to learn this. The news squashes it, media squashes it. I don't have any problem with what they were presenting here. It's like, yeah, this shit happened, we all know it happened. I think the thing that this leaves out so many things because it was the time, 71. You know, there were lots of angles they could have gone to. It was just opening up. It was an expose of sorts, and it was a way for the veterans to share their nightmare.
Yeah.
you know, honor their nightmare and make it a truth. But it also strikes me that in the historical moment, it was a courageous thing. It was very courageous.
Oh, yeah.
Incredibly courageous. Of course it was.
Yeah. A bunch of people want to get in.
Yeah.
Out of curiosity, like when it was shot in '71, like that style of filmmaking, getting like that point of view from the troops, like I assume was that, at least for like a documentary film genre, that was pretty new. I think for that period, wasn't it? Like you didn't see many like soldiers' perspective, especially kind of a very critical perspective of the government, basically in the film format like that prior to that time. I would think.
A sustained hour and a half of that kind of
Yeah,
way of
exactly.
thinking about
Now it's
Vietnam
common, but back
would be
then-
super unusual in that moment, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I can't see, I was wondering how they picked these speakers. Okay, there's 20 men. How many of the Vietnam veterans are there? Like millions? 2 million? Were in the Vietnam War? Do these 20 people speak for all? The people I know wouldn't do that. They wouldn't rape and kill and murder and chop off heads and this is an anti-war documentary.
I can speak a little bit to that.
What veteran component wants to continue war?
Well,
That would be the question.
Well, the question was, you know, how are these guys selected? And the reading I've done basically said that the Vietnam Veterans Against the War wanted to find guys who were in units that had served together, had experienced some of the same realities. They did very careful screening to make sure that these guys were who they say they were. They did a lot of work having them testify at the same time so they could either collaborate or not support each other's testimony. And it was a pretty select. There were a lot. The testimony is really long. We just saw a little piece of this, but they worked hard to vet them. And the first response from the government and news agencies was trying to discount these guys, that they were frauds, that they were fakes, and they expected that would happen. So they did a lot of work making sure that this testimony would stand. And the fact is, if you look at Nick Turse and some of his things, for frontline combat troops, unfortunately, this was a pretty common reality. And many of them don't, you know, the reality is if you were involved in this kind of stuff and you came back and your conscience kicked in, I'm sure this is really difficult stuff to own. And Ken Burns is a lot of the guys say, oh, I never saw this happen. But the reality is that we managed to kill 2 million people in the course of a 10-year war. 2 million civilians and 1 million Vietnamese soldiers. So I think it's hard. It's hard to credit that because these guys are just like me. I don't feel any different than any of those folks who testified, but at the same time, it's not something that's easy for us to look at.
To come back to your question though about, people, would they watch, would they not watch? It also, like, the Vietnam veteran is not like an amalgamation, right? There are different people who are inhabiting that space in different ways. The majority of people who went to Vietnam did not see active combat. So if you just wanted to do it like strictly in, those kinds of terms, no. Most people who served, that wouldn't have been what they'd done because they weren't in combat to begin with, right?
Is
But I
that
don't know that that
10%
necessarily,
or something?
but I don't know that that necessarily matters, right? But I'm just saying across, this is something that often comes up. Well, most people who were there, they didn't see combat, so I didn't have, but those who did, this is talking about an everyday reality of combat. Some people wanted to talk about that, other people don't, right? So, not every soldier who saw combat who was involved in these sort of things became involved in Vietnam Veterans Against the War, right? But those who did felt compelled to testify in the ways in which they did. Yeah.
So these very courageous people actually were criminals, right? They testify if they go to Hague, they all get like 20, 30 years in prison. Because there's nothing different between them and Milosevic, who died there, and who did the same atrocity during Yugoslav war. Now, we know that United States do not sign Hague Protocol, right? And my question is it this absence of this signing of Hague Protocol linked now to election of Donald Trump? And I would say it is.
Explain
What is
why.
Explain why, because Donald Trump with his formula America First clearly proposed these things to do that were done. He never said this because he never really was in this position. All his policies basically proposed to kill all others, whatever they are, without war. What he proposed with war? He proposed to nuke like everybody. We see now.
Who did he kill? He didn't kill anybody. What are you talking
Exactly, not yet, exactly, I agree
Not
with
yet,
you.
okay,
Not yet,
good.
but he like Putin, who killed a lot of people.
You're anti-Trump.
In
You-
Chechnya.
You got a closed mind. You're
Putin is an example for Trump, and he said this. Putin,
Trump, you have a close mind.
But just,
and Putin killed 200,000 people in Chechnya, really very similar way like America killing Vietnam, like others actually.
just to go back a little bit in time. So the United States under Clinton did not want to become a part of the International Criminal Court. And one of the reasons that the United States did not want to become a part of the court was there was the possibility that these kinds of war crimes could happen in the future, and the American state felt that Americans should not be brought to international justice in the ways in which other less powerful
But
states
why
could.
not?
But that,
Why not?
Why not? This is the key question.
We're peerless.
Because America's
That's
first
why.
and you get Trump. It's exactly my point.
That's why.
it's just to suggest maybe there's a slightly wider arc than Trump that gets us
I
to
would hope
that
the American
position.
people wouldn't charge me with a war crime if they said it.
Yeah,
They,
in
you
the
know,
best.
in Ken Burns' film and in this film, they don't really bring out the movement that was going on against the war. This, I mean, there's a little bit of it in this film where the guy says, I did all these things, and then, and then I talked to someone later, and when I came back, this person asked me, why did you do these things, or how do you think about it? But I think that was a reflection of this huge movement of millions of people in this country, and the whole cultural shift that was going on, where people gave some backbone. This movement gave some backbone to these soldiers to speak up against it. They all had long hair and they had come over to the counter culture. And I think that that's very important, the millions of people here, and the other thing that was really not brought out was how the Vietnamese were fighting for their liberation. Here, it makes it seem like they're just all victims, which, you know, many of them were. But many of them, too, were fighting against colonial or post-colonial imperialistic taking over of their country. And, you know, your comments don't bring that out either. You're saying, and I hated this about Ken Burns, it's kind of like they're all equal. Like the US is equal, you know, like everybody's a fighter here, or there's atrocities on all sides. I think that's a bunch of bullshit.
No.
The Vietnamese were fighting for their liberation, they fought against the French, and as soon as the French left, who moved in? You know, to dominate them.
No, I absolutely agree with you. The Vietnamese were fighting for exactly what you're saying they're fighting for. And Burns doesn't help us understand that. Simultaneously, there are atrocities going on, right? And one has to think about those simultaneously. So it's not to say that there isn't a reason that the Vietnamese are fighting, and also that there isn't a huge power differential between the Vietnamese and the Americans in all of this, right? That's absolutely central too. It's also true that the things are happening, right? And it just seems to me that one can talk about all those things simultaneously, and it isn't about whitewashing or trying to suggest that all sides are to blame. In the Burns version, I think that's how it goes. So it's hard to kind of put it back in there in a way that still acknowledges the other factors that I'm talking about, but I think it's important to have all those things going on at the same time. I mean, in defense of what's going on here, it's cinema verite, and they're capturing a moment when people are trying to come to terms with an explanation for what they did. They may or may not understand Vietnamese history at this point. Some people came to, I think, as the movement moved forward. So, you know, again, it's capturing a slice of the anti-war movement at a particular time and place. And that's essentially the kind of work that the film is trying to do. Yeah, up and back.
I have a question with regard to race.
Yeah.
Could you perhaps discuss a little bit about the veterans of color and their efforts to discuss the war, as well as the reception that they received for that?
Could you repeat the question?
The question.
I'm sorry, I was wondering if you could discuss a bit the efforts of the veterans of color to discuss the war, and what was their reception?
I think that actually the exchange that you see in the film is revealing of a wider set of patterns that were going on in that period of time. That within the African-American community, some, but not all veterans, were speaking out in the kinds of ways that were critical of what was going on. But the reception even in that community was sometimes hard to hear, sometimes not. Again, the African-American community is not a monolith, right? So depending on where people were in a kind of political spectrum, and depending on the time. I mean, by the time you get to 1971, I think people are much more willing to hear it perhaps than they were in 1965. But then again, it's varying about what a particular audience was.
Reception as in the reception solely within the African-American community.
Outside.
What was the reception of when African Americans or when Hispanics or when people of ethnicities and races outside of white would discuss these were our experiences in the war? How were they received?
I think that what was going on in Detroit with the Winter Soldier was unusual in putting a range of voices in front of people. That largely the anti-war movement looked white.
Yeah.
And it looked male, too. At its leadership, right? That's not true on the ground. There's all kinds of, women who are very important in the movement, but at that level.
I just wonder, to clarify, are you asking if there was maybe a separate group of veterans of color who were doing their own presentation, or you're talking just about what you saw here in this film?
I'm talking about in general, within the history of...
I wonder if there was a concerted, a separate voice.
Or were there other attempts outside of Winter Soldier? Were there other attempts by people of color to say, like, these were our experiences? Were there even attempts of speaking within their own community? How did that manifest? This sort of concern manifest?
But what was not so apparent to people in the moment, and often isn't apparent in the moment today, is how disproportionately those communities were affected by their service in the war, right? So, disproportionately, more African Americans served in Vietnam. Latinos, and Native Americans. Disproportionately, more were killed as well, right? Those were figures that I don't think even those communities, they began to understand that as the war was going on, but that wasn't something I think that people perceived in as strong a light as they came to after 1975. So in fact, those voices were central voices, given the ways in which combat worked and who was serving up front and who was serving behind. But again, I think that was part of the set of racial politics that was going on in Vietnam that also then would affect how people were being heard when they came home. Yeah.
We should mention Martin Luther King's speech at Riverside Church in Detroit on April 4th, 1967, a year before he was assassinated, where he called out the Vietnam War.
Muhammad Ali.
Sure, I think it was in the conversation widely.
That's one of the reasons why King was killed.
By 71.
Calling out
No
policies.
Vietnamese ever
Again,
called me nigger.
Yeah, right.
Remember that?
Certainly with Black Power, the Black Power movement, they were making all those connections.
The Black Power movement had just been
Eartha Kitt
massacred
got thrown
itself.
out of the White House.
Between Hanrahan and, or what's his name
Mark
here?
Clark and,
Yeah.
I mean, they were just systematically massacred. So the Black Power movement was being,
no black messiah.
no leaders were left living.
Can
And
you
that was kind of the reception that the government and the policies were going to give to the black community.
You know what, can you talk a little louder, because I wanted to hear what you had to say.
He can repeat it.
Peter?
Yeah, I want to talk a little more about the film itself.
Okay.
Because the film's not the anti-war movement.
Yes.
There's going to be no women talking about combat because they're not in it yet at that time in history. And just because it's a cinema verite film doesn't mean it's telling the truth. There were a lot more people of color, men of color in that room, soldiers of color, than we heard speak on the film. So the filmmakers made certain choices of what they wanted to do, what they wanted to say. The fact that not many people saw the film is more reflective on the time and the way that films were distributed in those days than the fact that no one was interested in it. In fact, I started to see anti-Vietnam War films that were made as early as 1965. And this film, I know people that worked on this film that came out of a whole anti-war and pro-Black Power, pro-women's liberation, all the various movements towards social justice of the time. And there are hundreds, if not thousands, of film. Help me with that, Milos. You probably have them all in the back room. So when you compare it to Ken Burns, who owns PBS and can put anything he wants on it, it's not a fair comparison. This film never made it in the theaters. It's on film, which means if you look in the back, you see the projector and the reels. You have to carry those. You have to have them in places to see them. And that film didn't get a Hollywood release. Probably the first anti-war documentary that did was Hearts and Minds, which is about 1975 or 76, after the war is over. So think about the influences that we have that aren't mentioned in this film that control commerce in the United States that don't allow films like that to come out.
Thank you.
Did this film get a distributor at all or no? In general? Like a small distributor at least?
In the moment, my understanding is no. In the early 2000s, there was then this effort to circulate it more widely. It was here in the United States, it was at festivals in Europe and that sort of thing.
But the Vietnam Veterans Against the War had 16mm copies, which they used for community screenings, to mobilize against the war. I mean, this was a tool in part of the movement.
That's right.
And you would see it in places like Facets, which is why Facets is so important and why we have to continue to come.
We've still seen in this, just like we saw at Abu Ghraib, that there really is no ability to pierce into the leadership to bring culpability. above to where it really lies. I mean, arguably. One of the things that those guys were talking about again and again was standard operating procedure, which meant that they were essentially charging the chain of command with neither preventing that nor, I mean, they were essentially condoning it, which makes them culpable.
They were ordering
Which
it.
is the problem we've still had again and again and again. We cannot get between those lone crazies like, what was it, Cali in Levi and Johnson. There's no connection. We're still, as citizens, we're unable to do that.
There's no accountability.
No accountability,
Can
thank
you
you.
tell us a little bit about Hugh Thompson?
Written in McNamara's report for Johnson,
It's written, but
it doesn't get,
He was
it doesn't get distributed.
a
But there's
pilot
no
and he
connection
protected
between
people.
us and our government that's really doing anything about it.
But Hugh Thompson, people have to know about Hugh Thompson. Yeah, he was a helicopter pilot,
gotta speak
machine
up
gun.
louder.
Can you speak up?
Hugh Thompson was a pilot of a helicopter, and he was instrumental in protecting
Yeah.
the Vietnamese from being slaughtered by other
This was at Milai.
yes.
Yeah, he came here
And he
about
came here
20
to
years ago.
Chicago, and we met him, and he was really a beautiful human being. So if you can read about his life.
I wanted to bring up something similar to that this movie did not talk about, that type of thing, that people in the military actually went against orders and actually killed their superiors. Now, this was probably more later than 1971. But the other thing I wanted to bring out was that while these people had, tremendous courage and saying what they did, and they became part of a movement to end the war, it also illustrates something horrible in our society, and that is that these people can only do this after the fact. In other words, when the orders came down, they were in the middle of it. At that time, anyway, people did not say, "What the fuck are you talking about?"
Secretary of Defense McNamara, he said the Domino Theory was a mistake. He had a documentary, I don't know if you saw it, but he had a documentary about that. And that was the justification for the war in Vietnam, is the Domino Theory. Can you speak on that?
Why?
That's a justification for the war.
Why?
I just want you to let him do it.
Yeah, McNamara deciding it was a bad idea came a little bit late in the day, but
40 years too late.
well, and again, people are right to push back on my going too much to the Ken Burns thing, but essentially, the argument in that documentary, which I think becomes a kind of mainstream, my students walking into a course would probably think this sort of argument, is that there was this Cold War that was going on, and we had to be there because of that somehow, right? And so the Domino Theory is just one way of saying that, right? They were all gonna just fall down like dominoes if Vietnam went, they were all gonna go, blah, 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 right? But that's the kind of default position for Burns, that there's this communist insurgency going on, our Cold War sort of magically falls down after World War II, the French really can't cope with it, so what else could we do but go in, right? The fact that McNamara could, even late in the day, say that that was a flawed policy is telling, it seems to me, about the kinds of optics that people had about thinking about a place without, as you were saying earlier, understanding the history of the place and what people were about and what people wanted in one form or another. It was just a place on a map with red, right? And that ability not to be able to see place is another common pattern across the American wars of the 20th century and the 21st century, right?
And the 18th, and the
18th, no, that's right. But in that sense, you know, McNamara can say, oh, the Domino Theory maybe wasn't a good idea, but the idea that there's been a lot of learning from the Vietnam War and not understanding particularities and extending that into another set of wars, that sort of learning doesn't seem to me to have happened. Yeah.
When you first asked your question, what our initial thoughts or reactions to the movie were, some of mine are that how little things have changed.
Yes.
You know,
Yes.
and one thing you point out is how little we knew about Vietnam, but we don't really engage with other cultures, like hardly at all. Like right now, we have this thing about Islam, right? And we see Islam as a monolith, kind of like we saw communism as a monolith in the 1950s and 60s. So
it's become the new convenient monolith.
Exactly, exactly.
Like terrorism, like the terrorist now was the communist.
Well, it's
One thing
reinforced with
that-
McCarthy.
One thing that really irritates me is that we don't have like any sense of Vietnam outside of the U.S. engagement there. Like we don't know that it was a French colony and how the French used the people. Like it was a cash cow for France. They used it in an imperialistic way because it was a profit maker for them. It was very rich. They could pull natural resources out of it. And when the French were fighting at post-World War II, because they were broke, they had no money after World War II, the U.S. was supplying them with money, you know, for their military and so forth. And we're unable to really examine at a deeper level, like the root causes, the profit motive, you know, that a lot of colonialism and what the U.S. does now is because of money. It's
Follow the money.
Power.
Yeah. You wanted to get in for a while, yeah.
Well, I think Peter's right that from my point of view, we need to look at the film itself. And what we're talking about is a lot of things that we know now about things that were happening at the time, the historical influences and so on. And I think that this film is not about that at all, that it is about these young men coming to a different understanding, and that it's a very, very valuable, I guess you would call cinema verite, piece of history that in itself tells us a lot. And if we look at it now from a more distant point of view, I think one of the things that's very clear to me was that these young men were struggling with the concept of masculinity that was extremely important and serious to them. And that when most of them, when they went to war, they thought they were living up to this concept of masculinity. And in the process of being a part of the war, they had to understand that in a different way. And so I think it's a profound movie, but I think it's a mistake to say it didn't do this or it didn't have this, because the movie itself makes no attempt to contextualize anything. It doesn't have a narrator, it doesn't have any other aspects to it besides the testimony of these young men at this particular point in American history and what they went through in coming to terms with what happened to them.
Yeah. No, I mean, interestingly, it's like anti-context at the very end. So in the stills where you're getting the list of names, you see at the bottom at a certain point that the entire testimony was put into the congressional record.
Yes.
But then they pivot to the throwing of the medals, and that would be another place where a filmmaker could, if they chose to, you know, have the little scroll line that would say what that was about. And again, I don't say that to be critical, I just say that that's a position on their part, I think, to leave that be in the ways in which they do. Which may point to the fact that what they wanted people to be going to is exactly what you're talking about. The only scene in the film that like really pushes against that in a way, I think, in what's the most interesting sequence of the film, now having seen it about 3 or 4 times in the last week, when the African-American vet, but who is not up on the stage, confronts those white guys, and being able to watch the confrontation, and being able to watch the kind of body language that's going on, and just the facial look of, you know, so, well, here we are, you know, we're doing what we think we should do, well, it's not enough, you know, and it's just the kind of back and forth of that. That, like, just seems like an incredibly real moment that's captured that would be really hard to like narrate any other kind of way. But like you see the pushback and you see the tension and you see them recognize that it's that and have to, you know, kind of think about that. So it's also a film that I think does help us understand their evolving sensibility about what it was they went through, and we get to see a piece in a way of how that happened, which I think is a kind of neat part about the film. Yeah.
Well, I think it was a gift that they gave us, filmmakers, but particularly the people who gave testimony. I think it was really a gift to us, the American people, and I knew about this film. You can see some of it on YouTube, but you know, I just feel very lucky that I could actually see and hear this, and without any what someone calls whataboutery. There was nothing about, well, then they did this to us, so then we felt like we, you know, they were really just talking about themselves, you know, their experience, what they saw and heard. And I think that's what makes this very special. There's no narration, there's not any exposition, because really this wouldn't even, it could be any war, but this is a war that we were around for, at least, you know, I was. And so I think it's just really, you know, a valuable document. I wish it were more, I wish it could be seen on PBS. I'm just saying,
Yeah.
you know, I'm just saying.
Can I, one interesting moment though is, you know, John Kerry has that little fleeting presence, right? And when my students see it, that's the only face that they get, right? And so initially they want to talk about John Kerry, and then you say, well, you know, it's not really a film about John Kerry, it's about, oh, you know, and so it's just that, but it also has the stabilizing impact, I think, on younger people who are coming into this with more of a set of fixed images that they recognize, of which Kerry is one because of all the political fallout for him as time has gone by. So it does some work now that probably it wasn't intended to do back in '71, because who knew who John Kerry was then, but right now it
So
does.
this has never been transferred to DVD?
No, this has been transferred to DVD.
Is it?
Yeah, I have a DVD at home of this.
Yeah.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, you can buy it
Probably
online.
find it online as well.
Yeah, in fact.
Listening to all of this, you know, we're reflecting on what occurred and in our political structure, and then we can't ignore the fact that we were all part of this, we're culpable, you know, but I don't want to say the bottom line, you know, but you know, politics is power, and this one segment, you know, which you know, is so important not to ignore, is the military makes it, once you're drafted, you know, makes it a point to dehumanize the individual, you know, to take away any choice, any will, any direction, you know. So the military is preparing you to look at the other as the enemy in whatever shape or form, you know, it's presented at that time, you know. And this is something that has continued. I mean, you know, we're still part of this, you know. The military is driving the world scenario, you know. It's not a, I don't know, it's not a way of looking at society or humanity, you know, in a compromising or reflective situation, but it's always aggression, you know. We're selling arms to Saudi Arabia so that they can dehumanize and wipe out Yemen. You know, we're selling arms to Israel and benefiting in the process, you know, in order to, you know, wipe out the citizenry in Gaza. I mean, you know, and these examples go on and on and on, you know, but it's all driven by the military, you know, that conditions that mindset, you know, in our social psyche.
And they have trillions of dollars on account.
Oh yeah.
Which I guess, you know, to me is why the movie both feels about a historical moment and about a present, right? And that it works on people now, I think, in important kinds of ways, and it does something historically at the same time. Right? Yeah.
You talked about the the why, like he mentions when he's when they're having that conversation and he's not on the stage, he's like, you know, we come and talk about these atrocities, but we should talk about why. And his reason, like a big part of it was racism. And I would agree that it's like, it's present, but I don't think it's like the root cause of everything. But somebody mentioned there was another Winter Soldier in 2008.
2008, Iraq and Afghanistan. It's online, you can go and
Yeah, so like they're throwing their medals in this one, and then in that one they were like throwing their medals.
No, in 2008 they just did a panel testimony. They did it in DC and in Detroit as well, and then 2012 there were people in Chicago that threw their medals back. But if you
Yeah, back at like NATO headquarters or something like that.
they tried to ceremoniously return them to the generals, but they didn't let us, so then we threw them back.
And to me, it's like you had the scene with the native guy speaking. I don't know if he was a veteran too, but I thought that was really interesting, especially if you look at like Standing Rock. Like when I first heard about Standing Rock, I watched a Democracy Now! Video where they were attacking people with dogs, and in the capital of that state, in the Capitol building, they have murals of like people attacking Native Americans with dogs. Like, I don't know, 100 years before or something like that. And so to me it's just really interesting if you're talking about the why, just how many like patterns and connections there are with like a lot of our conflicts and a lot of like how we begin them, like the justifications for them, like yeah, for me it's kind of overwhelming because there's like so many patterns. Like if you start to like really look into it, the more you look into it, the less
crazy rabbit hole
hope you have. Like I thought like Chile was like I heard about the coup in Chile, this like CIA supported coup where they like, you know, they helped like spread this fear that the workers were gonna rise up, and so in response to that fear they like brutally cracked down on all the people and started torturing them, and we ousted this democratically elected leader, which we say were for democracy and freedom, and we helped install this like brutal dictator who tortures people in a soccer stadium. And even Americans, like they would come into your place, and if you had books they didn't like, that they considered leftist, they would take you off to the soccer stadium and torture you. And so it's like, and I thought when I found out about that in school, I thought that was like a one-time thing, or not very common. And then you get into like William Blum's work, and you find out like the US has been doing this to many countries, like either killing them or like, you know, supporting coups or whatever. And so for me it's just like, I think the why is a really good question. Like why are these things happening? Why do they continue to happen? Like why are there so many very similar patterns with a lot of this stuff?
Are you aware there's a coup in this movie too? There's a coup in South Vietnam leading up to the stuff that you hear? You want to say something?
In 1963, it's not unlike what happens to Allende in Chile, except Ngo Dinh Siem, who's the leader of South Vietnam in the 50s and early 60s, is not a socialist, so he's not like Allende in that way. But the Americans eventually, they put Siem into office in 1954. They're essentially, the CIA is essentially culpable in the coup that removes him and his murder and his brother's murder. So there is, as you say, an American coup. I would just also say, just in reaction to your thoughts, that I think that's another value of the film. Like the people in the film, they're raising the why questions. Like they're making you and me think about that, right? And that has a certain kind of power, right? That brings it, it elicits a discussion about things that we might not otherwise talk about. And that's different than just explaining what happened, right? Yeah.
A couple of things. One is that Native American people have the highest percentage of people who are in the military of any ethnic group in this country. That's one. The second thing is the pictures of them with the Vietnamese that they were murdered and all that. They have the same kind of pictures of from 100 and 150 years ago of military people in the West, in the Dakotas, Colorado, the Colorado Territory, the California, whatever, the same kinds of pictures. And photography had just started then, of soldiers with dead Native American warriors or dead women and dead children. If you read Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee, so that's all there. The second thing that struck me about the movie was the real I consider it a breakdown, but the whole point is that the officers did not lead the troops there. The officers made it possible. If the officers had stood up and said, no, you can't do that, probably a lot of those things would not have been done. So there was something about what happened with the officers in their training, or the kinds of people that they put in these positions for these forward troops that were engaged, that were the combat troops. The officers that were in those, that were leading those men, were not leading those men. My husband was talking about Hugh Thompson, who we met here when he came, because he, a guy who was a reporter for the New Orleans Picayune, went and found him because he basically was career military, and after Vietnam, he couldn't go anywhere with his military thing. So he stayed and served his time and tried to keep his nose at the waterline. And then he went into the Veterans Administration. And then finally this guy found him and got his story about Vietnam. And he was the exception in the way that proved the rule. Because he stopped My Lai. He stopped them from extending, because they had plans to extend that all the way up whatever valley that village was in, and just wipe out, I don't know, 1,000 or 10,000 people or something. And he stopped that massacre there, and they didn't continue on with the plans. So if more officers had stood up for that, for being humane as opposed to slaughtering people and treating them like gooks, or like, whatever derogatory, dehumanizing that they did with enemies, then a lot of this stuff wouldn't have happened. But that was because it was set up like that, in my opinion.
From up above were to get the numbers. So that was policy from up high. Is we need a body count that looks impressive. It didn't matter what it was impressive of, because they were lying about everything to the people anyway.
Yeah, I could speak just a little bit to that. From what I've read, as an officer, you were there for 6 months, and you had 6 months to kind of prove yourself. And actually, you're right, I think, about the body count, in the sense that became, I used to watch it on television. We used to get the news, we'd get the update of how many Vietnamese had been killed.
Yep.
And so officers were incentivized to make sure that this kill ratio was high. There were areas where the kill ratio was like 342 to 1. There were individual soldiers who claimed, who had body counts of over 1,000. And so this was really incentivized from the officers, passing it down to the men. And the idea was, but you don't get caught. Don't let as he said, don't let anybody know outside of this what's going on. But we all know what the deal is here. So in a sense, the officers were very much leading the men, and by keeping silent, by not saying you got to stop this, they were furthering their own careers, and they were also, encouraging, allowing the killing that went on, and they were leading.
You both have wanted to get in for some time, so start here. And then
Okay. South Vietnam asked the United States to help them with economic and military aid in the 1960s because the communists were going to come and take over. But when we got out of there and they took over Saigon, Vietnam right now is a communist country. It's a socialist country. They control the whole Vietnam, and in that way, we were trying to stop them, and now they took over the communists.
I mean, that it is a one-party socialist state that runs a market economy. So, one of the ironies about the kind of end of it all is that the way Saigon looks today is the fondest hopes of American economic development experts in the 1960s, right? They never thought they'd be able to get Vietnam into, the position it's in. So, yeah, the state operates in a particular kind of way, but the economy, similar to China, operates in a very different way. And again, there's a certain irony there in the kind of strictly who won, who lost kind of thing.
But when the communists took over South Vietnam, weren't there a lot of atrocities committed by the communists when they took over?
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
But I mean, okay, what?
No, I'm just saying, it might have been, it was right for the United States to help out these, because they wanted us to help them. We helped them with economic and military aid, but then all these anti-war people, we got out of there.
What were these atrocities? You're an academic. Could you list these atrocities that the gentleman's talking about?
I think what he's referring to is that the re-education camps that were established by the Northern government after the war were really, really quite awful.
Well, they may have shot people, but they didn't slit open bellies.
No, I mean, this was not, like, people thought what happened in Pol Pot's Cambodia might happen in 1975 in Vietnam, and nothing like that happened, right? So that's not it. But, I mean, again, you can parse what's more brutal and what's less brutal, but if you speak with survivors of a re-education camp who were there for a 15-year stint, it's a pretty harrowing story that they tell.
Right.
So again, we were kind of there earlier on this too. These are just realities, like lived realities, but they don't necessarily mean that, from my perspective, that the American intervention was wise, or that the American intervention, was moral. It doesn't. The one doesn't equate to the other for me. So I can acknowledge that the things happened, but it doesn't necessarily make me think differently about what it was Americans did in Vietnam.
So, previous speaker suggests that American intervention was correct. And let's for a second think that it's true. However, atrocities that were there, not correct by any means, because you have Geneva Convention. Now, I'm wondering if America have a war in a shithole versus war in Norway, are they behave differently? Because we did not hear about atrocities with Second World War of American troops. We actually heard that they were very relatively to Russian troops who basically raped everybody, every woman in Germany. American troops were polite. And I'm wondering, they were polite to Germans, but not polite to Vietnamese. Or it's just coincidence?
I don't think it's as cut and dry as the Americans were just polite to.
No, not polite, it's the wrong word. Not atrocious, I would say this, in Second World War.
Well,
not atrocious.
Rape is now a war crime, and there certainly are many, many incidents of American servicemen raping French and German women.
Right, but not in this, they not kill everybody like by village. Come some German village and kill everybody there. Came on somewhere place and opens the stomach of German person. This is not heard of. It could be Russian could do this, maybe not. But in Vietnam War, it's totally different level. Moreover, one happened in 40s, another happened in 60s. Apparently, your humanity should grow, not go down. And so, this would argue that, as Donald Trump said, you go to shithole, you kill and rape everything, but go to Norway, you will be polite.
Right.
This is the only point.
Yes.
Well, isn't rape, the history of war is rape, civil war, rape. All these countries, when the victor comes, they rape.
Well, I think the racial argument that this man is proposing does hold water for me.
Yes.
And in my readings, I have not as an adult, I've always been reluctant to delve into the atrocities committed, especially by my own country, because it's a nightmare, and I don't particularly want to pollute my own consciousness. But I have to, as an adult, I have to face what my country did. North Korea was just about exterminated by the U.S. after World War II. And
Well, who did they drop the bomb on? Let's think about that.
Yes. So
I mean,
that's-
duh. I mean,
Jump in.
it's,
I
you know.
agree with my friend. Also, in addressing an earlier comment about it's unfortunate that the commanding officers of the U.S., did not show more humanity or something. I want to question that narrative, because the idea that there can be good commanding officers who are going to be humane in a war, that stretches credulity. I mean, we like to believe that the U.S. is a good person, We have this bias. It's really hard to get rid of because we're so inculcated with it from the time we emerge from our mother's womb that America are the good people, But, when you start to total up the atrocities that the U.S. military has committed, we're giving some of the worst characters in history a run for their money. So I want to challenge, the fact that, bad things happened in Vietnam just because the officer class, there were a few bad apples, or because they weren't trained properly or something like that.
Right.
To your point that in some spaces Americans seem to be able to feel as if they can behave in certain ways and in other spaces not, I think that's right. And so I think there is a racial dimension to what's going on. On the other hand, American troops behaved in certain kinds of ways at the end of World War II. We just need to talk about that too. It's not to do equivalences, it's just to say that that's part of the messy, complicated history of our past as well, right?
Well, I think calling it messy and complicated is understating it. We have an atrocious history full of genocide, and it's what's built our country. And if you can't say it that strongly, then you're whitewashing it.
I'm not so sure about that.
So messy is like a nice way of sprinkling sugar on it or something.
Yeah.
It's beyond messy. It's
Slavery,
atrocious.
slaughtering
Slaughtering of Native Americans, atrocious. And it was always a land grab. We can push the Indians off so we can grab land, and even to refer to them as Indians, it's like, that's still going on. And so, yeah, messy is just understates what it really was. It's racism.
It is.
One thing
It's
I'd like
racism.
to say.
But we are
is
very
that
religious, see, we
I'm
have
from
faith,
Blackfoot Indian,
so we can
and
kill
most
under the
Indians
name of faith.
refer to each other as Indians. But, that also may be like nigger, If you are, you can do it, and if you're not, you can't. But we call each other Indians.
They mentioned this in the movie, that they were given like Geneva Convention cards and, what to do if they were ever taken, give them your name and your number and like all this stuff. But what kind of information were they actually given? I mean, if you know that, like what were they given about the Geneva Convention before, like during the draft? Do you know, if you know?
Didn't he say none? Like, didn't he say like,
Well,
the only instructions they were given are if you're captured, all you have to give is your name and social. To me, it reminds me of like how citizens in the United States don't know how to engage police. Like, people don't know their rights. Poor people are used to them getting trampled. Like, to me, there's a lot of connections. Like, what I saw on the inside of the military was not a few bad apples. Like, it's a culture, and it's widespread. And like, the Geneva Conventions, like, there's people who don't even know what that is. They don't know what like habeas corpus is. They don't know that we've like lost it now. They don't know about the National Defense Authorization Act, the Patriot Act, like the core stuff in there that's like gutting the Constitution. Like, yeah, for me it's really hard because it's like, I go back to the why, like I was talking about earlier. It's like, there's this idea that I think I see where people can learn these things and be like, okay, but now I'll become like liberal, or now I'll become a Democrat, and I'll like I know families that put like a no war in my name sign in their lawn, and then they feel like their hands are washed, and it's like not, they're not part of it. But it's like, to me it's like, it goes beyond the military. Like it's the prison industrial complex, the agricultural system, like companies like Monsanto using military contractors in Central America. Like, I had drill sergeants who said like horrible things about raping young girls and all kinds of things, and this was not in the 60s, this is like nowadays. There's guys in like elite units who've watched their first sergeants like play with people's brains on the hood of their Humvees, and like anyone who tries to speak out against stuff or go against anything, this one dude was like taken back to Colorado and tortured, and his dad's trying to investigate it, and it's like, you know, good luck with that. You're never getting on base. You're not going to talk to him. It's like, for me, it's just like, I don't know, like seeing it from different sides. It was really hard to sit there in college. Like I had a professor later on in Arizona. We had this class on war and peace and film and literature, and she made this point that like aren't all at least like well-made or as truthful as can be war films, anti-war films. Like to me, any honest documentary about war is going to be an anti-war documentary, because we weren't made to kill each other. Like, and so anytime we think we can sanitize war and keep it going, like we will be reintroduced to the same patterns that have been going on since the beginning of like the lies that founded our country. Like Howard Zinn talked about in the People's History of the United States, like when you whitewash like Columbus and all these other people and like these genocides and atrocities and all that, you build this foundation of lies to continue working from. It's like, why do these things keep happening? We keep romanticizing our past and all the horrible stuff. We just romanticize it as this thing that's like, well, we can conduct sanitized precision wars. We can go in there like surgery and take out the terrorists, just like we used to take out the communists. And it's like nowadays, there's like domestic terrorists. If you're fighting for like land and water rights, you're an eco-terrorist. There's all these internal FBI programs, like watching like religious groups in the Northwest who aren't involved in any type of violence or terrorism at all. The fact that they speak out against militarism and against like our vast destruction of the environment, like they get targeted, to me it's just amazing that like, I don't know, I'm really grateful that you facilitated this conversation, that people are even here watching a film like this, because I think like our culture is so saturated in propaganda and disinformation, and like it's just incredible. Like stuff like this doesn't really get out. I feel like a lot of the communications I try to send back and forth to people are like censored, and like, I don't know, if I really went into it I'd probably sound like a conspiracy theorist, but it's just like, for me I think there's a reason that we're being like shown over and over again, like this is what happens when you put your faith in this system. Like, I don't think it's, like to me the president's like a PR person, and they're there to kind of like calm people down. And it's like there's all these connections, and I mean, a lot of things, like there's this like school shooting in Colorado with these two guys a long time ago. The town where that school shooting happened, they make bombs there. And like, I think the bombs being made there were being used somewhere when the school shooting happened. And for me, it's like, we look at all these things as like separate things. It's almost like with the bad apples and all this stuff, we're always trying to like take stuff apart and not like, I don't know, this kind of like, we have this like scientific confidence that we can analyze individual things and be like, and we make these statements, and like when I hear them, I'm just like, duh. Like if I'm listening to NPR, they'll be like, it's just weird that we take things apart and we analyze them as if they aren't connected to a whole, like as if we're not like an ecosystem. And it's strange to me because like, I don't know, maybe that's our way of like disconnecting ourselves from it so that we can try to look at individual things objectively, but in the same thing, it's like we disconnect our responsibility from it. Like if we're working and paying taxes, is like being like a college student or a liberal or a Democrat or whatever, just a way to like escape and not really have to like really stand up. Like I would wonder if people from the countries that are being oppressed and like used, like we have like the World Trade Organization, the International Monetary Fund, from my understanding, they go into these countries, they set up infrastructure, and then they're like, now that we've set up this infrastructure, your country owes us. We can use your labor for cheap. We can use your resources. Like, we can just like crush these places. If any of these countries that are being like exploited, raped, blown, we're bombing, what, 7 or 8 countries right now? If any of them were brought here and allowed to be a U.S. citizen and have all the information and like, and stuff that U.S. citizens have, like, would they be doing things the way we try to do things? Like, would the way they would try to enact change, would it be the way we do it? Like, because we have these like established political systems, and I hear about these like campaigns where it's like vote or die, or something like that. To me, that's really interesting because it's like my choices were between Trump and Hillary, which was like, it made me want to go vomit. And the only candidate who was even like remotely I saw as a candidate was Bernie Sanders, and he didn't even make it into the Democratic nomination or whatever. And so for me, that was just like, everybody was mad at me for talking about not voting and stuff, but like, for me, it's really hard to, and I think for a lot of returning soldiers, like I have friends who've like come back, no one wants to hear from them, no one wants to talk to them. One of them got hooked on pills, lost all his teeth, like lived in his mom's basement. Everyone just kind of looks down, and now he's homeless. Another guy drank himself to the point where he's mentally handicapped now. I don't know anyone who's come back and like reintegrated. And but we act like our system works, and I don't know, like we just gotta keep going with it or something. I don't know. Just for me, it's like we're really good at identifying all the bad stuff. Maybe we're not. Like, it seems to stay mainly in academic circles. Like, I feel like if a lot of the stuff in academic circles was like spread out to the larger society and like the working classes, if people really knew about stuff like this, then it would be harder for them to vote for candidates who were against their own interests, because then they would know that like we have this history of this.
Most people don't vote, so don't feel bad. Only about half the country voted.
9,000
certainly worked out
tons
well,
of
didn't
plastic
it?
shit.
Not at all.
9,000
But
tons.
I will agree with you, the candidates, we're not really.
Well, he started talking to me like I did.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks for coming.
But the elections were won by 49% of voters. That's not a huge turnout.
Let's just take 3 more comments, and then I think call it a night. Yeah.
The United States is a superpower that keeps peace in the world. Now, Trump is getting away from that. He's getting away from that. He's getting more isolationist. We'll see what happens. We'll see what happens. Okay?
We will. Yeah.
I'm a member of Veterans for Peace, although I'm not a veteran. I just became tired of the war, so I wanted to become active somehow. But one reason that some of our members aren't here is that they are traumatized, and they will be traumatized for life. They all have PTSD, our combat vets. And like our friend here said, the effects are long-lasting. We lose about 21 or 22 veterans to suicide a day. Those are the costs of war that never enter the public calculus in our political system. And our friend is also right when he says that we're just not, we just can't handle this sort of thing, you know. And in fact, you don't even have to be a combat veteran to suffer what is now being called moral injury.
Yeah.
So some people who were never, you know, killing anybody directly, because they participated in something that they find wrong later, they suffer long-term mental health effects.
I think the most current, the thing that had the most currency was in that racial discussion where the man points out that black people don't have any choice, but that a good choice is to go into the service, and that's still the case today. And I think I want to add to the people who fight our wars are not just people of color, but people without money as well. And I'm pretty sure, having talked to other friends of mine of draft age in Vietnam, when we got out of, in the Vietnam day, we grew up not far from here. We all went to Lakeview High School, and very few of us got drafted. Or some of us, I got drafted, I got a 1Y, it was called, which meant they would call me if they needed me. And the reason that they didn't need me was because the neighborhood adjacent to where we grew up was Uptown, where the American Indian population was and the poor white population was. So when the draft board, which was on Diversity and where Broadway and Clark split there, certainly got who they needed and never had to call me or my friend Tom or all the other of the guys in our class. So that's I think that's the real currency that we can look at.
There's a fabulous book by a colleague of mine at UMass Amherst, Chris Appy, called Working Class War, that goes directly to that issue within the working class war about the Vietnam War. And really, it does a really great job of demonstrating that and talking about what the implications of that are.
Say his name again?
Chris Appy, C-A-P-P-Y.
Thank you, Mark.
Thank you all. You know, like, can I, no. But I just say, the final testimony to the film is this was a fabulous conversation, right? And the film enabled us to do that. So I'm grateful to the filmmakers for, across time and space letting that happen, and Milos more immediately prompting us to be able to have that
I think it's, if you look at the number of films that have been made about Vietnam, which are many, I mean hundreds, right? How many of those films really approach anything substantive like this short film made on no budget in one situation really does? I mean, so you can critique about what's not there, but what is there is really pretty layered, pretty deep, and pretty provocative. And thank you so much for really facilitating this.